January 1943. The Russian winter raged across the steppes, a merciless wind slicing through tattered uniforms and frozen boots. Smoke curled from ruined buildings, mingling with the icy fog that hung over Stalingrad. The distant roar of artillery punctuated the silence between shell bursts. Soldiers crouched in trenches, faces streaked with grime and frostbite, clutching rifles that had grown cold in their hands. Far to the south, in North Africa, the desert sun beat down relentlessly, reflecting off the sands near El Alamein. Tanks crawled over dunes, engines growling, sand seeping into every crevice. Dust storms blotted the horizon, yet the Axis and Allied forces pressed forward, each maneuver measured, deadly, and fraught with risk. 1943 was a year when the tides of war hung in precarious balance. From the frozen banks of the Volga to the scorching sands of Egypt, the Axis and Allied powers collided with unprecedented ferocity. Decisions made in the icy trenches and the arid deserts would ripple across the continent, shaping the very course of the war. The stage was set for a turning point that would redefine Europe. By the end of 1942, Europe was a continent engulfed in fire and ice. The Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany, had expanded deep into the Soviet Union, occupied much of Western Europe, and threatened North Africa. Yet beneath the apparent dominance, cracks were beginning to form. In Stalingrad, the Soviet defense had stiffened beyond German expectations. On the southern front, British and Commonwealth forces had regrouped after earlier defeats in Egypt, preparing for a decisive confrontation at El Alamein. The German army, confident in its mechanized prowess, underestimated the endurance and industrial capacity of its opponents. On the eastern front, the Wehrmacht pressed toward the Volga, aiming to capture Stalingrad and secure the oil fields of the Caucasus. Months of brutal fighting had reduced the city to rubble. Streets were lined with destroyed tanks, burnt-out trucks, and shattered buildings. Snipers and artillery dictated the rhythm of survival, while civilians and soldiers alike fought amid the ruins. The German Sixth Army, encircled and cut off from reinforcements, faced increasingly desperate conditions. Supplies dwindled, frostbite claimed the weak, and morale teetered on the edge. Meanwhile, in the deserts of North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps and the British Eighth Army engaged in a deadly chess match. Supplies became the decisive factor. Fuel, water, and ammunition dictated movements across the vast, sun-baked terrain. Convoys struggled to reach the front lines, threatened by enemy ambushes and relentless air attacks. The capture of El Alamein would open the Mediterranean to the Allies, enabling a push into Europe through Italy. Across the Atlantic, the United States and Britain ramped up production at a scale previously unimaginable. Factories churned out tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Yet it was not just weapons, but the logistics to move them across oceans and continents that would determine success. Long supply lines, convoys under threat from U-boats, and coordination with multiple Allied commands created a complex network that needed to function flawlessly under pressure. The global scale of the war had made 1943 a year of decisions that could no longer be delayed. In the East, the Soviets prepared counteroffensives, gathering reserves, and reinforcing supply lines. In the West, the Allies sought to wear down Axis forces through attrition and maneuver. Each front influenced the others, a delicate interplay of strategy, logistics, and human endurance. Technology and innovation became crucial. The Germans relied on advanced tanks, aircraft, and mechanized units, but faced supply limitations that increasingly hampered operational tempo. The Allies, by contrast, combined technological adaptation with sheer industrial might, integrating new tanks like the M4 Sherman, improved artillery, and effective radio communication systems that allowed coordination at scales the Germans struggled to counter. Intelligence played an equally decisive role. Signals intercepts, reconnaissance flights, and capture documents provided insight into enemy movements, feeding planners who sought to exploit weaknesses with precision. The human cost of these strategic moves was staggering. Civilians in occupied territories endured bombings, forced labor, and food shortages. Soldiers faced attrition in harsh climates, from the frozen steppes of Russia to the desert heat of Egypt. Yet despite exhaustion, fear, and loss, determination remained. Each side recognized that 1943 would be the year to seize the initiative or lose it irrevocably. In northern Russia, the encirclement of German forces in Stalingrad marked a pivotal moment. Soviet commanders, employing deep reserves and winter-hardened troops, cut off the Sixth Army from reinforcements. German attempts to resupply by air failed to meet the massive logistical needs of tens of thousands of soldiers. Starvation, disease, and relentless Soviet assaults wore down the defenders. The once unstoppable Wehrmacht began to falter, illustrating that momentum alone could not compensate for strategic overreach. At the same time, in North Africa, the Eighth Army prepared meticulously for a decisive strike at El Alamein. Allied planners understood that the desert offered few natural barriers. Control of roads, supply depots, and water sources would determine who advanced and who retreated. Intelligence reports on Axis positions, combined with deception operations, set the stage for a confrontation that would shift the balance in the Mediterranean theater. 1943 was not a year of single battles, but of interconnected decisions. Logistics, technology, terrain, and morale intersected across multiple theaters. The actions taken on these fronts would converge, setting in motion a series of turning points that would redefine the European war. From the frozen streets of Stalingrad to the burning deserts of North Africa, the stage was set for operations that combined strategic vision, human endurance, and the industrial might of nations. The conditions of this year made it clear. Victory would not come from one decisive blow, but from the coordination of countless moving parts, from supply chains to communications, from tank crews to artillery units. It was in this complex environment that 1943 would emerge as the turning point in Europe. By the spring of 1943, the consequences of winter fighting in the east were unmistakable. The remnants of the German Sixth Army had surrendered at Stalingrad in February, marking the first major defeat for Hitler's forces. The scale of the loss reverberated across German command, shaking confidence and forcing a reevaluation of strategy. German generals who had assumed victory now faced the reality that their supply chains, stretched over vast distances, were vulnerable to disruption and overextension. Stalingrad had exposed a critical weakness. Even the most disciplined and mechanized army could collapse without adequate logistics and coordination. On the Western Front, Allied planners observed these developments with keen interest. The American and British high commands accelerated preparations for combined offensives in Europe, recognizing that Germany's overextension presented an opportunity. Lend-Lease supplies flowed in ever-increasing quantities from the United States. M4 Sherman tanks, with their versatility and reliability, were being mass-produced and shipped to British and American units. Each Sherman carried not just armor and a 75mm gun, but also advanced radio systems that allowed unprecedented communication across tank formations, an advantage the Germans had yet to fully appreciate. In North Africa, General Bernard Montgomery and the Eighth Army advanced methodically after the pivotal Battle of El Alamein in November 1942. German and Italian forces, led by Rommel, were forced into retreat across hundreds of miles of desert. The Allies understood that success relied on more than firepower. Supply lines had to be maintained across hostile terrain. Trucks, repair units, and fuel depots became as decisive as infantry and armor. The logistical efficiency of the Allies allowed the rapid exploitation of breakthroughs, preventing Axis forces from regrouping effectively. Meanwhile, in the skies above Europe, the Allied air offensive intensified. Bomber Command targeted industrial centers and transportation hubs, aiming to disrupt German production and restrict troop movements. Aircraft like the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator flew in formation over heavily defended territories, dropping tonnage after tonnage of bombs to cripple factories and railways. Each mission demonstrated the interplay of technology and human endurance. Crews faced flak, enemy fighters, and extreme fatigue while maintaining strict formation discipline. These aerial campaigns compounded the logistical challenges already plaguing German armies in the east and south. The year also saw innovation in armored warfare. American forces in particular emphasized combined arms tactics, integrating tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support in coordinated operations. Sherman tanks, equipped with radios in every unit, enabled commanders to direct movements in real time, synchronize attacks, and respond dynamically to changing battlefield conditions. German forces, while technically proficient and often superior in armor on a one-to-one basis, were hampered by slower communication systems. Radio silence, delayed orders, and reliance on courier messages limited their ability to counter rapidly coordinated Allied advances. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets capitalized on these advantages. Operation Uranus, the encirclement of Stalingrad, had proven the effectiveness of coordination, logistics, and numerical superiority. Soviet commanders learned to integrate infantry, armor, and artillery with precision, exploiting weaknesses in German formations and supply lines. The lessons of winter warfare shaped subsequent operations in 1943, including offensives around Kursk, where defensive preparations would be matched by unprecedented Soviet depth and planning. The interplay of supply, technology, and human endurance became increasingly evident. Allied convoys delivered fuel, ammunition, and spare parts across oceans and battlefields with remarkable efficiency. Repair depots, maintenance crews, and logistic planners ensured that tanks and artillery remained operational despite harsh conditions. Meanwhile, German forces struggled to maintain cohesion. Overextended lines, attrition, and the constant threat of Allied air interdiction limited their operational flexibility. The imbalance between industrial capacity and battlefield endurance became a decisive factor. By mid-1943, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the strategic trajectory of Europe. The Germans, still formidable in tactical engagements, faced a multi-front threat they could not easily counter. Allied armies, reinforced by superior logistics, communication networks, and technological integration, were positioned to exploit every weakness. The battles to come would test command structures, endurance, and innovation under pressure. The combination of Stalingrad's lessons, North African advances, and technological integration created a new paradigm in warfare. Coordination between armies, the reliability of supply, and the ability to communicate instantly across armor formations were no longer auxiliary concerns. They were decisive elements of strategy. By the summer of 1943, Germany's previous dominance was being challenged systematically on multiple fronts. From the frozen ruins of Stalingrad to the deserts of North Africa and the industrial landscapes of England, the gears of war were turning inexorably. Supply chains, mechanized units, and radio communication systems were not just supporting tools, they were shaping outcomes. The battles that defined 1943 were no longer solely determined by raw firepower, but by the capacity to sustain, coordinate, and exploit momentum across vast theaters of war. This context sets the foundation for understanding the multifaceted angles of the turning point in Europe. The interplay of human endurance, tactical innovation, technological superiority, and leadership decisions would converge to reshape the course of the conflict. Across the battlefields of Europe in 1943, the human cost of war was impossible to ignore. Soldiers on all sides endured harsh climates, constant danger, and exhaustion that tested both body and spirit. In the bitter Russian winter, men froze in poorly insulated foxholes, rations scarce, and morale fragile after Stalingrad. On the African deserts, troops battled heat, sandstorms, and the relentless pressure of pursuing or retreating forces. Yet within these grueling conditions, acts of endurance, ingenuity, and courage emerged. American and British tank crews, in particular, faced unique challenges. Operating Shermans in diverse environments required acute focus. Mechanical failures or misfires could prove fatal. Yet the men inside these machines relied not only on training, but on the trust instilled by advanced communication systems. Every order, warning, or repositioning instruction transmitted via radio meant the difference between survival and disaster. Crews coordinated maneuvers, executed flanking actions, and responded to unexpected threats, all while the physical and psychological discipline required under extreme stress. The human dimension extended beyond combatants. Mechanics, supply drivers, and support personnel worked tirelessly to keep armored units operational. In North Africa, maintenance crews labored in sun-scorched depots, replacing engines, repairing tracks, and improvising solutions with limited resources. Each tire replaced, engine repaired, and fuel delivered directly influenced the frontline effectiveness of armored formations. The war was not won solely by those firing weapons. It depended equally on the tireless, often invisible efforts of those ensuring the tools of war continue to function. Across the German ranks, human resilience was equally tested, but often constrained by logistical shortfalls. Units exhausted from long marches, disrupted supply lines, and the psychological toll of strategic defeats faced mounting stress. Morale wavered as reports of Allied advances mounted, and soldiers recognized that their ability to respond effectively was increasingly compromised by operational limitations. The human element, endurance, discipline, and adaptability was becoming as decisive as tactical skill or firepower. Responses to ambushes, flanking maneuvers, and counterattacks, giving units flexibility that rigid German communication structures could not match. Tactical innovation also extended to logistics. The ability to rapidly supply fuel, ammunition, and spare parts directly influenced maneuver strategies. In North Africa, Montgomery's careful planning ensured that armored thrusts were not limited by terrain or supply constraints. Every advance was calculated to maintain momentum, exploiting both enemy weaknesses and the operational reliability of Allied forces. German commanders, conversely, were often forced to react defensively, constrained by slower lines of communication and overstretched supply networks. Coordination across the battlefield also depended on reconnaissance and intelligence. Aerial surveillance and radio intercepts provided actionable information that could be communicated immediately to tank commanders. Shermans equipped with radios ensured that this intelligence translated into tactical decisions on the ground, enabling rapid repositioning, concentration of firepower, and exploitation of gaps in enemy formations. The convergence of technology, human endurance, and logistical support created a tactical paradigm where mobility, communication, and rapid decision-making became decisive. Armies that could adapt to this new model gained a distinct advantage, demonstrating that modern warfare was no longer determined solely by numbers or firepower, but by the ability to act cohesively and responsively across multiple dimensions of the battlefield. By 1943, technology had become a decisive factor in the European theater. Tanks like the M4 Sherman, the Panzer IV, and the T-34 represented more than armor and guns. They were platforms for advanced communication, mobility, and firepower integration. Among these, the Sherman stood out for its radios, which allowed real-time communication between tank crews, commanders, and supporting infantry. German units often underestimated this capability, believing that Allied coordination relied on visual signals and messenger runners. The radios enabled tank commanders to call in artillery strikes, request reinforcements, and adjust formations on the move. This flexibility transformed the Sherman into a force multiplier, turning a small number of tanks into a coordinated strike element capable of overwhelming numerically superior but less connected forces. Engineers had also simplified maintenance and repair procedures, ensuring that tanks could be returned to action rapidly, a critical advantage in high-tempo operations. In addition to tanks, technological advancements in logistics, intelligence, and air support reshaped the battlefield. Convoys transported fuel and ammunition with unprecedented efficiency. Reconnaissance aircraft provided actionable intelligence, and artillery coordination systems allowed for rapid targeting adjustments. Each technological improvement was not isolated. It was part of a larger system that synchronized human effort, strategic planning, and battlefield execution. Leadership angle. The decisions of commanders in 1943 were pivotal in exploiting these technological and tactical advantages. Leaders such as George S. Patton, Bernard Montgomery, and Georgy Zhukov demonstrated the importance of decisive, flexible command. Patton's insistence on speed and operational audacity depended on reliable communication networks. Without radios in his Sherman tanks, rapid flanking maneuvers would have been far riskier and less effective. Leadership extended beyond grand strategy. It involved understanding the interplay between human endurance, equipment capabilities, and tactical opportunity. Commanders who integrated intelligence, technology, and logistics into operational planning created synchronized movements that often outpaced German responses. German leaders, by contrast, faced increasing challenges coordinating forces under constrained communication systems, relying on static assumptions that the Allies' momentum would falter. Morale and motivation also fell under leadership responsibilities. Leaders on all sides had to maintain discipline, encourage initiative, and manage fatigue. Those who succeeded in harnessing the full potential of their troops and technology often turned the tide of engagements, proving that leadership could amplify the effectiveness of both human and mechanical resources. Enemy angle. German troops in 1943 were often caught off guard by the combination of Allied technology, mobility, and coordination. Their own tanks, while formidable in firepower, frequently lacked the integrated communication systems that enabled Shermans to operate cohesively. This disparity meant that German units struggled to anticipate maneuvers, respond to flanking attacks, or concentrate fire effectively. The German command assumed that the Allies would be limited by logistics, terrain, and coordination difficulties. When Sherman columns moved faster and more unpredictably than expected, defensive plans faltered. Units were forced into reactive positions, abandoning prepared fortifications, and often engaging in piecemeal battles against coordinated Allied forces. The disparity in communication and situational awareness contributed directly to mounting operational stress, eroding morale, and strategic setbacks. Moral angle. War is not only fought with weapons and machines. It is shaped by human ethics, endurance, and responsibility. In 1943, the speed, efficiency, and coordination of armor campaigns placed immense strain on soldiers. Tank crews, artillerymen, and infantry faced relentless pressure to execute orders precisely and swiftly. Mistakes could be fatal, yet the demand for rapid action was often unavoidable. The moral implications extended to the support networks. Supply drivers, mechanics, and engineers operated under dangerous conditions to keep combat units supplied. Their labor, often unarmed yet essential, carried profound personal risk. Decisions about prioritizing fuel, ammunition, and medical support reflected the intersection of morality and strategy, choices that determined who would survive and who would fall. Despite these pressures, camaraderie, initiative, and ethical decision-making flourished. Soldiers improvised solutions to save lives, maintain equipment, and ensure mission success. The human dimension of war was inseparable from the technological and tactical. It was the moral courage to act under relentless strain that enabled operations like Patton's rapid advances and the sustained use of Sherman tanks to succeed. January 1943. The Eastern Front groaned under winter's weight. Snow blanketed the steppes outside Stalingrad, transforming rivers into ice and roads into mud-laden traps. German 6th Army units, encircled by the Red Army, struggled to maintain cohesion. Radios crackled sporadically, often failing under the bitter cold, leaving isolated units desperate and disoriented. Commanders tried to coordinate relief efforts, yet each message arrived too late or never at all. Meanwhile, across the Western Front, the Allies were refining combined arms operations with unprecedented efficiency. Sherman tanks, equipped with advanced radios, coordinated across battalions, and with supporting infantry and artillery. Commanders could adjust formations in real time, request reinforcements, or redirect strikes with precision. The speed of communication turned mobility into a weapon, amplifying both tactical flexibility and operational tempo. German units, accustomed to slower, line-of-sight coordination. Columns advanced in tight coordination, guided by real-time radio commands. German and Italian defenders were forced into reactive positions, abandoning prepared defenses under relentless pressure. Patton's insistence on speed and initiative meant that delays, once fatal, were now mitigated by constant communication. The battlefield had become an arena where information, more than raw firepower, dictated survival. In every theater, a pattern emerged. Units with advanced radios, flexible leadership, and reliable supply chains could outmaneuver, outfight, and outlast those without. The combination of Sherman's, radios, and coordinated infantry assaults exemplified modern warfare's turning point. German commanders, confident in their tactical doctrines, faced disillusionment as Allied mobility, precision, and adaptability shattered assumptions. By late 1943, momentum had shifted irrevocably. In Italy, the Gustav Line resisted frontal assaults, yet American and British forces exploited intelligence, communication, and artillery coordination to bypass the strongest points. In France, training and coordination allowed Sherman units to probe German defenses, identifying weak points, coordinating supporting fires, and exploiting gaps with speed that German forces could not match. Radios had become the nervous system of the battlefield, connecting sensors, shooters, and commanders in an operational web. Human endurance remained a critical factor. Tank crews operated under fatigue, mechanical strain, and constant danger. Yet the ability to communicate with other units, receive updated orders, and adjust tactics in real time reduced confusion and prevented catastrophic losses. Leadership capitalized on these technological advantages, allowing audacious maneuvers that reshaped engagements. It was not merely the tank's firepower, but their integration into a networked system of command, control, and coordination that transformed battlefields. As 1943 drew to a close, the Allies had demonstrated a fundamental truth. Wars could no longer be won by sheer numbers or isolated units. Victory demanded synchronized technology, leadership, logistics, and human resilience. The turning point was not a single battle, but a cumulative effect of coordinated operations where communication and adaptability determined outcomes. German troops, still relying on slower, less flexible systems, could not anticipate the speed, precision, and cohesion of Allied armored formations. The battlefield had evolved into a complex, dynamic system. Sherman tanks, radios, combined arms, and logistical networks converged to create an operational advantage that reshaped strategy. By winter, the Allies had seized the initiative across multiple fronts, forcing German forces into retreat, defensive postures, and strategic recalibration. The decisive moments of 1943 set the stage for 1944's blitz across Western Europe, demonstrating that communication, coordination, and speed were as lethal as artillery barges or armored firepower. The interplay of technology, human endurance, and leadership had reached its zenith. The Allies were no longer reacting. They were dictating the battlefield, forcing German forces to contend with an enemy they could not outmaneuver or outcommunicate. This section of the climax illustrates the transformation of European warfare, from attritional, reactive engagements to high-tempo, coordinated operations where radios, logistics, and initiative determined the course of history. By December 1943, the landscape of Europe had shifted dramatically. Allied forces, after months of relentless campaigns in North Africa and the early stages of the Italian peninsula, had seized the operational initiative. Ports, roads, and airfields under Allied control facilitated continuous supply, allowing mechanized units to advance further and faster than German planners had anticipated. Every captured town and strategic pass carried more than tactical advantage. It represented the widening gap between the logistical capabilities of the Allies and the constrained resources of Axis forces. German high command faced mounting frustration. Reports from frontline commanders detailed repeated setbacks despite determined defenses. In Tunisia, Axis units had been outmaneuvered by fast-moving Allied armored columns. In Italy, entrenched positions were bypassed through coordinated advances involving infantry, artillery, and Sherman tanks communicating in real time. The Germans, relying on slower radio networks, messenger systems, and fixed defensive lines, could not respond to the fluid battlefield. The operational tempo of the Allies forced repeated withdrawals and reorganization under pressure. The strategic impact extended beyond immediate losses. The Axis powers now faced the reality that the Mediterranean was increasingly dominated by Allied logistics and air superiority. Supply lines to North Africa had been severed, and the German-Italian hold on southern Europe was increasingly tenuous. The failure to anticipate the Allied ability to coordinate complex, multi-theater operations compounded existing resource shortages. Fuel, ammunition, and manpower could not be redistributed quickly enough to stabilize front lines. German commanders repeatedly noted the psychological toll. Troops demoralized by constant retreats, equipment losses, and the unrelenting pace of Allied advances were less effective in combat, compounding the material deficiencies of the Axis war effort. Allied planning capitalized on these advantages. Operations were increasingly coordinated across fronts. Sherman tanks, equipped with advanced radios, formed the backbone of armored thrusts, enabling real-time communication with infantry, artillery, and headquarters. Supply columns maintained momentum, and engineers repaired bridges and roads as rapidly as units advanced. The operational efficiency demonstrated in Tunisia, Salerno, and along the Italian coast became a template for future campaigns. Commanders understood that victory now depended as much on sustaining tempo and communication as on individual engagements. Casualties and losses were measured carefully, reflecting the high cost of offensive operations even in the face of success. Allied forces suffered from battle damage, mechanical failures, and environmental challenges. Yet the losses of the Axis were more severe. Encirclement, artillery strikes, and the inability to respond dynamically to Allied maneuvers resulted in thousands of captured soldiers, abandoned equipment, and disrupted supply lines. German reports from late 1943 highlighted the growing challenge of maintaining coherent defensive positions. Retreats were no longer orderly. They were reactive, often hastened by pressure from mobile Allied forces exploiting every breach. Morale, both human and institutional, shifted as a consequence. Allied soldiers gained confidence from their ability to advance rapidly, supply lines functioning smoothly, and command decisions transmitted instantly through advanced radios. Conversely, German troops confronted uncertainty, with fragmented communication contributing to misjudgments and delayed responses. This disparity illustrated a fundamental truth of modern warfare. Operational superiority rested not only on firepower, but on coordination, information flow, and the ability to sustain forces under pressure. The 1943 turning point reshaped European strategy. German planners were forced into defensive postures along key rivers, mountain passes, and urban centers, while the Allies prepared for further thrusts toward northern Europe. Strategically, the Allies leveraged their advantage with precision. The Italian campaign, though grueling, became a proving ground for combined arms operations. Sherman tanks, infantry, artillery, and engineers moved in synchrony, exploiting gaps in German defenses. Communication networks allowed commanders to adjust tactics in real time, responding to breakthroughs, obstacles, or counterattacks without delay. Each victory reinforced the concept that technological superiority, when paired with efficient logistics and leadership, could dictate the pace and outcome of campaigns. German forces faced a crisis of adaptability. Static defenses that had once held against slower, less coordinated forces were now vulnerable. Retreats became the norm, often executed under fire and with limited resources. Supply shortages, compounded by Allied air interdiction, limited fuel and ammunition availability. Reports from late 1943 note the increasing reliance on improvised defensive positions, ad hoc reinforcements, and emergency withdrawals. Morale suffered accordingly. Troops faced not only physical exhaustion, but the psychological strain of knowing the enemy moved faster, communicated better, and maintained a logistical edge. The human cost on both sides was stark. Allied soldiers endured the hardships of extended campaigns in harsh terrain, facing mines, artillery, and counterattacks while maintaining relentless operational tempo. African American drivers and support personnel in logistical units, often overlooked in contemporary reports, sustained mechanized advances by ensuring a constant flow of fuel, ammunition, and provisions. Their endurance under heat, fatigue, and threat of attack proved indispensable. Conversely, Axis soldiers confronted encirclement, dislocation, and attrition on multiple fronts, leading to high casualties, captured personnel, and an erosion of unit cohesion. Lessons in operational art became clear. The Allies demonstrated that victory in modern warfare required more than individual battlefield success. It demanded mastery over the entire operational environment. Logistics, communication, coordination, and adaptability were as decisive as artillery barges or armored thrusts. The ability to sustain momentum over hundreds of kilometers of contested terrain forced German forces to constantly adjust, often reacting rather than initiating, a disadvantage that would have lasting consequences in 1944. Politically and psychologically, the implications were profound. Success in North Africa and southern Italy bolstered Allied credibility among occupied populations and neutral powers. Conversely, the Axis experienced both strategic embarrassment and internal debate. Commanders questioned prior assumptions about Allied capabilities, underestimating the integration of technology, supply, and human resource management. These miscalculations shaped defensive priorities and contributed to delayed responses in the campaigns of 1944. By the end of 1943, it was evident that the war in Europe had entered a new phase. Allied forces had not only gained territory, but had demonstrated that modern warfare was a contest of systems as much as of soldiers. Communication networks, supply chains, and operational planning had proven as lethal and decisive as any tank or gun. German forces, constrained by infrastructure, overstretched supply lines, and reactive command, were increasingly vulnerable to the sustained, coordinated pressure of Allied operations. The 1943 turning point thus set the stage for the next year of conflict, where the advantages established, technological, logistical, and organizational, would be fully exploited. The success of these operations reshaped strategy, altered perceptions of modern warfare, and underscored the human and material costs of sustained, high-tempo campaigns. Allied forces, guided by these lessons, were poised to convert operational momentum into strategic victory, reshaping Europe's political and military landscape forever. The events of 1943 marked more than a series of battles. They marked a transformation in how war was fought and understood. Across deserts, mountains, and shattered cities, the Allied forces demonstrated that victory was no longer solely the result of courage or brute force. It was the seamless integration of technology, logistics, and leadership that allowed armies to move faster, strike harder, and endure longer than ever before. Sherman tanks, radio networks, engineers, and drivers, all often invisible to history, became as decisive as rifles or artillery. For the soldiers, the turning point was lived in dust, mud, and smoke. Men endured relentless marches, artillery barges, and the ever-present threat of encirclement. Behind them, the meticulous work of supply units, mechanics, and planners ensured that every mile advanced was sustainable. Their labor, often unnoticed in headlines, was the quiet engine of momentum, proving that human endurance and organizational discipline could shape outcomes as powerfully as any battlefield maneuver. For the German forces, 1943 was a sobering revelation. Assumptions of Allied logistical weakness and slow operational tempo were shattered. Defenses that had seemed secure became vulnerable, and every retreat exposed the fragility of overextended supply lines and inflexible command structures. The lessons were harsh and immediate. War had evolved, and those unable to adapt would pay a heavy price. Historically, the turning point of 1943 underscored a universal truth about modern warfare. Mastery over resources, communication, and coordination can be decisive, sometimes more so than sheer firepower. The successes and failures of that year reverberated through subsequent campaigns, shaping strategies, doctrines, and the ultimate outcome of the conflict. Yet, beyond strategy and technology, the story is profoundly human. It is about